Hello Internet, and welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm, the show where I talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. Fair bit to talk about this week, so let's just get into it. Now first off, I did want to touch on power grids being added to the game over the last, couple of months now. You may or may not know there's been some movement with houses having wiring and the player being able to plug in appliances into this grid. Now currently, it's very much in the early stages, and I'm pretty sure you still need to power it using a vehicle. I was going to cover these changes as they came, but it did sort of get away from me. I plan at this point to make a video entirely devoted to how this works. At this point, I couldn't just jam it in here. It would have to be something like a tutorial about how it works. And unfortunately, I just frankly don't have a lot of time, so that may or may not ever happen, but I did want to point it out in case you wanted to do some research on your own, or maybe ask people in the community and have them explain how it works. Anyway, the first new change that we're going to talk about this week is an update to the contents of car trunks. This was added by Feeping Creature. To boil this down to a very simple explanation, you will now more commonly find tires, jacks, and tire irons in the back of cars. This has been a point of annoyance for me since Wield started requiring tire irons. They are not craftable and it could be hard to find them. Additionally, I've had games where I had to craft a jack myself because I couldn't find one. Now I know that not everyone has a proper road kit in their car, flares or kitty litter or whatever, but I would guess that the majority of vehicles in the world have a jack and a tire iron. It always bothered me that our cars did not reflect this, so simple change, but it does fit with realism and it will benefit you ultimately, so I do like this change. Next up, and everybody stay calm, don't freak out, we've had some minor changes to the game's default key bindings from WAP Caplet. Specifically, this removes the keybinds for toggling the minimap and for hiding recipes in the crafting menu. To be clear, this does not remove these from the game, it just removes them as something that is bound by default. And at first, I did what I always do when I see changes to controls, I got annoyed. But then I thought about it for about 5 full seconds and I realized how good of a choice this actually is. If you've been in the community really at all, then you've probably seen people who have accidentally pressed the capital N key to hide their minimap. Or you may have seen people who bump the S key and hide a recipe, which, even I have done that. And this leads to a lot of confusion for people who don't know why this happened. I personally find that hiding the minimap is a really crucial control, yada yada. I play with the game scaled up, so I need the extra space for my logs sometimes. However, I do think that these changes will ultimately prevent new players from being confused. And honestly, a confused new player will lead to a frustrated new player, and that might mean that they just walk away from the game entirely. Now I know this is a small change, I know that people hate when controls get swapped, but yeah, I think ultimately that this will benefit newer players and prevent people from bumping the wrong key and having something disappear on them. The controls still do exist, so experienced players or people who want these controls can still have them bound to a key and you can still use them like you always have. Unlike some of the other control changes, this PR does not seem to forcibly change your existing controls, so everything should be exactly how you left it unless you change it yourself or you get a fresh installation. Next up from Malmix 3, we've got some updates to fridges in the game. There were a couple of PRs for this, I believe, and there are more coming in the future, but I just grabbed one here to use as an example. Basically, it looks like they're planning to rework all of the fridges, or at least many of the fridges in the game, tweaking them and what they spawn. Currently, if I'm remembering right, most fridges in, say, a grocery store or a restaurant or pizza parlor, they're set specifically in each map gen. This means that the person who makes the location controls what goes in those fridges, or they pick from one of the existing fridge groups of items. The problem is that a lot of these variants are very, very old. They either spawn basically nothing, or in many cases their loot does not really fit expectations because they use really generic spawn groups. Now many of the item groups that they pull from have also not been updated in a really long time. Now this individual is updating fridges to use these sus item groups, which you probably don't care about what that means, but we've talked about it before and it is a very good thing. This will standardize fridge loots and hopefully update them to be a little bit more sensible. Is it sensical or sensible? I don't know, I always say sensible. One PR, for instance, has already gone over office building type locations that would have a fridge, say like in a break room somewhere. They've made sure that it spawns appropriate foods and drinks like sandwiches and bottled water or soda, and they ensured that there were no alcohol spawns or anything like that which would be inappropriate to keep in your office fridge. They do have future plans to address house fridges, fridges in survivor bases, looking at restaurants, fast food places, things like that. There's There's really not much to say about this. I'm just sort of glad. It's a nice little change of pace, someone looking over item groups and updating them to use sus containers. So I'm glad you're doing this. Maybe after the rework, we'll see a little bit more variety in those house fridges. Honestly, I'm really tired of finding just sort of jelly over and over in house fridges. I mean, be honest right now. Do you know anybody who buys a 3-liter jar of jam? No, you don't. Stop lying. They belong in like a commercial kitchen or something, not some rando house. It always bothered me that we had a 3-liter jar of jam in basically every house, but I believe someone also added like 3-liter tin cans at one point in the past, and you never find those anywhere. And nobody needs 3 liters of jam. It's just ridiculous. Now moving along here, we've got a new scenario from Jonathan Lockridge. You might remember, well, it's been a long time I guess, but we did talk back in the day when the addition of the Star Fort was added to the game. This was an old fort that came with the addition of some zombie reenactors, and I thought it had been added to starting scenarios, but apparently it wasn't. So this new scenario is called Unliving History and spawns you in this location. There's really not much to say about the change itself. I'm always on board for new scenarios. It does currently lack a description. That's about all I've got in terms of suggestions. Someone really ought to add a description for this. For the location itself, I think it's a cool idea, the fort, but the enemy spawns and the loot spawns both look a little bit kind of like reminiscent of old locations. And when I say that, I mean locations that have been in the game for a long time. So the item spawns seem a little bit light, the enemy spawns seem a little bit heavy, but also just sort of clustered together instead of spread out, things like that. Also, I did notice that the starting NPC can spawn outside of the fort depending on where you as the player spawn, so that's, not really great. However, none of that is in the scope of this PR. All this PR did was make it available for a scenario. However, I do think the fort could use a little love. If someone's out there, if you're looking for a pet project, this seems like a neat little thing someone could work on. But yeah, new scenario, always happy to see those. Moving along now. Next up from Guardian DLL, we've got a new type of boomer, the Bombardier boomer. Is that how we say that? Bombardier? I have some confusion over this creature, but I am going to try to keep my general concerns restrained here. Essentially, this enemy explodes when it gets close to you. The damage that it deals exists in a cone towards the player. It is all cut damage, so it makes you bleed a lot and it rips up your clothing pretty badly. And unfortunately, due to limitations of the spell system, it always targets your torso. This is an ongoing issue with the game. Many things in the game only target the torso, and I think that that's actually a huge problem that's starting to develop. In my testing with this creature, it didn't seem to matter if I was wearing armor or not. I always seemed to take around 20 damage. I am assuming that that's a bug. I don't really know why it would completely ignore my armor. And this is an upgraded form of a boomer. They will start appearing probably not until at least like 10 days into the game, and because there are other upgrade paths, they probably will be somewhat uncommon. And that's the gist of this creature. I just don't really get it conceptually. I don't understand why it has a directional explosive in its chest, or why it's blowing out its rib cage, or whatever its mechanism for this damage is. I don't really understand why it's completely cut damage. It's actually hugely difficult due to severe bleeds and ripped clothing as a result. But honestly, the real problem I have, it just doesn't really make sense to me. I've tried to talk about this with people about 3 times now, and each time people have said, well, what about the gasoline zombie? And yeah, frankly, the gasoline zombie is the most bullshit, nonsensical enemy in this game. I don't feel like pointing to one bad creature is a justification for adding another creature that doesn't have a lore explanation. Most of the boomers in the game don't actually blow themselves up on you until you have dealt damage and killed them yourself. They are mostly things that the player kills and then they rupture and spray filth or whatever around them. So it's implied that there's a buildup of pressure in their body, and when they're killed, this releases. However, this creature, the Bombardier, is built specifically to blow out its own torso to damage enemies really as soon as it gets close to the player. I've never liked things like that in video games. Our zombies evolve to become stronger, more effective, more powerful. Why would something evolve into a form that literally can only destroy itself with minimal impact on an enemy? It just doesn't really make sense to me, and the thing masterminding zombie evolution is smart enough to know that this is a waste of a creature that could otherwise have value. Now, speaking about them stat-wise, I think they're totally fine. I think their speed might be just a smidge high, and their HP I also thought was high, but it's actually pretty comparable to some of of the other boomer upgrades, so I think that's mostly fine, but I also don't really think it fits with the concept of the enemy. Something that's built to destroy itself probably would not be very resilient, so I think having high HP is a bit of a misstep. Mostly, I just am confused about them conceptually. I don't think they really jive with the lore, and it looks like the justification for adding them was just a hand wave saying, well, why shouldn't they exist? And I really don't think that that in and of itself is a good way to reason out a new addition. Overall, it's not a problem if a few things get added now and then with that explanation, but I don't think that that should be a theme or something we shoot for. Anyway, I don't particularly like these creatures, but they're not terrible, they're not game breaking or anything like that. I think it will be perfectly fine. It's not going to like derail your game or something. Moving along now, next up from MQ Rouse, we've got the ability to wear or wield items directly from the pickup menu. Previously, attempting to pick up an item that did not fit in your inventory would have the game prompt you to wield that item. Now, I'm not sure when this disappeared exactly. I thought it was when the pickup menu got reworked a couple months ago, but looking at this PR, it seems like it might have just happened. So I don't know that one, sorry. But anyway, this allows for players to directly wield or wear items from the pickup menu. This means that you can target an adjacent tile with your pickup key and then wear or wield through that menu. This allows you to pick up adjacent items a little bit more easily. For example, if I just hit the W key to wield something, it will display a long list of all nearby objects that I could wield. But if I first target a tile using the pickup menu, that means there will be fewer items displayed and it'll just be a little bit easier to navigate. There's not much to say about this really. I did see someone on Discord complaining about the query going away, so this should smooth out some of those type of concerns for people. Oh, and as a last minute addendum here, someone just told me that the keybinds do not work because they get assigned as letters to the items. What this means basically is that the letters that are assigned that you would press for these keybinds actually get assigned as an inventory letter for the objects you're looking at, which means that these keybinds don't actually work. We've had this issue before with other controls. This is something that's going to have to be fixed in the future, but you can for now rebind them to controls that are not usually assigned to inventory lettering. Next up from Drew4484, we've got some updates to the whole propane and new steel variant thing we talked about previously. They have now successfully added propane tanks to the game along with the different types of steel. There's also now crafting recipes that allows the player to convert between the different steel types. Now the propane tanks themselves seem to have the highest chance to spawn in places like a steel mill or a megastore, garages, places like that. I don't ultimately know how all of this shakes out. We're going to have to play for a while to see if the spawns feel appropriate or not. And the steel variants mostly appear in the same sort of locations, and again, who knows, if the spawns are good or not. It's going to take some time to feel that out and dial it in. I am happy to see this continuation. Again, I'm pretty psyched to have propane added to the game. The steel variants, I'm a little concerned about this, mostly just because it's a pretty major change that will end up needing a lot of auditing to bring items and vehicle parts and stuff in line with the new materials. Adding the crafting recipes to allow players to convert between the different metal types, that's a good call. I'm glad to see that. It should smooth out some of the woes that come with transitioning like that. And then finally today, let's talk about grabs and suffocation, some changes to the mechanics surrounding enemies' abilities to pile up on top of you. Now this change comes from Bombastic Slacks. Essentially, it's a new mechanic that causes you to start suffocating when you're grabbed by enemies. The more enemies that grab you and are around you, the faster you will suffocate. There will be messages in the logs to let you know when this is happening. And the general idea here is that you've got a pool of air that gradually depletes and then will begin dealing damage to your torso. This is explained in the PR as being some work for portal storms. And I believe that there's a specific enemy that was added that does this, and even though it does occur also on zombies. And alas, I have some concerns over this feature. Now I really like the idea of suffocation, I do. I like the idea of having an enemy that does this as a special ability or a special attack. I really like the mental image of random horrors coming through a portal and piling on top of the player until they begin suffocating. I think that is a fantastic idea and it's a really cool mechanic. However, the implementation and the application of this to zombies I think is a poor choice. Firstly, the actual logistics don't make sense to me. In my testing, I spawned 3 zombies and allowed them to grapple with me. It took quite a few turns, but I did eventually begin receiving messages that I was suffocating. So this appears to happen even with a very low number of zombies. 3 zombies pressing against you, standing up, not against the wall or anything like that, they're not going to be crushing you to the point that you experienced a prolonged inability to breathe. So I really don't think this aspect of this change makes sense. Alright, so look internet, this is a brand new feature that will be changed and tweaked over time, as is the case for most of what we talk about on this show. And frankly, I'm trying to be less negative, okay? I know you hate when I'm negative. Well, actually, some of you really seem to like it, which worries me because this is a great game and you should not be looking for someone to gripe about it. And I guess I'm a little sad that I put myself in a position where I'm expected to, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I have many concerns over this system. I feel that the number of people you would need to compress a person to death while they are standing up with nothing but bodies around them is a very high number. This is not something that 6 or 8 zombies who are lunging, biting, and clawing at you would actually cause. It would take dozens of enemies in order to do that. Or you would have to be pushed up against the wall where there's no give, right? Like if they're pushing you against other zombies, they get pushed out of the way as well. But if you're against a wall, you're being compressed against the wall. I could see it happening in that situation. Or you could be knocked down and then have them pile on top of you. I think that would be another really good route to go. So that's my take. I don't really think this makes sense really for the zombies with the lore that we have in the game. I have a lot of concerns over what this is going to look like in the future, and in the PR at one point it said that this feature was designed to circumvent player armor. And for me, that's got my alarm bells ringing. I feel that armor values need to be nerfed, enemies need to scale better, etc. I don't think you should be designing a mechanic just to circumvent armor. But maybe that's just me reading too much into it. So yeah, that's my brief take. Be glad I deleted my initial bullet points, which would have been like 14 paragraphs of me explaining why I feel these things, and let's just leave it at that. It's a new feature, I've explained how it works, and I was a bit disappointed to see a mostly positive reaction to something that to me just flat out doesn't make sense. I don't see any justification for how 3 enemies are compressing me to the point of suffocation. Now all that said though, in most situations the player finds themselves in, you're not going to be at any real risk of this happening. It takes a really long time for the player to suffocate, although that rate is increased as more enemies surround you. If you're playing the game normally, if you're breaking grabs as they come and you're killing zombies as you go, you're really not in any danger of this killing you. And that is ultimately what keeps me from really popping off about this change, because the effects are so minor in most game circumstances. But I have a lot of concerns over what this looks like in the future, and I think that currently it doesn't really make sense. And with that, internet, I think we're going to wrap this show. Hopefully that all made sense. I tried to not be super negative about the suffocation thing, but I am concerned about its direction. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I provided some amount of value to you with this show here. So thanks for being here, and I of course will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode.